Good morning, Wabash. Today, speaking at Pioneer Chapel is Dr. Ted Cohen with his talk entitled, The Men in Our Mirrors. Theodore Cohen is an Ella Fulton Dunham Professor of Sociology and Chairperson of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Ohio Wesleyan University in Delaware, Ohio. Before joining Ohio Wesleyan in 1984, he earned his BA in Sociology from Brooklyn College of the City University of New York and his MA and PhD in Sociology from Boston University. In addition to teaching at Ohio Wesleyan, Dr. Cohen has taught at a variety of public and private universities, including Boston University, Northeastern University, and Clark University in Massachusetts, and Rowan University in New Jersey. In 1990, Dr. Cohen received the Sherwood Dodge Shanklin Award for the Encouragement of Teachers, one of his 2 awards Ohio Wesleyan gives for teaching excellence. Cohen's research and writing have centered on family, life, and gender, with particular emphasis on men's experiences. In addition to being the author of the last 6 editions of The Marriage and Family Experience, Dr. Cohen is the author-editor of Men and Masculinity, a text reader. He has also published articles and books, chapters, and conference papers on aspects of men's lives, especially men's traditions to marriage and fatherhood and their experiences of family, friendship, and work. Dr. Cohen has also conducted research on the family and work lives of a sample of non-traditional married heterosexual couples, either with at-home dads or employed in opposite non-traditional shifts. He notes that among his passions are the music of Bruce Springsteen, John Mellencamp, Phil Collins, and Tom Waits, New York Yankee baseball, and episodes of Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm. Wabash, please join me in welcoming Dr. Cohen.
Good morning, Wabash. I have spent some time trying to immerse myself in the Wabash culture, so I've watched a few of these, and I know that they always start off with the Good Morning, Wabash, and I wanted to make sure that I delivered on that too. I'm very happy to be here. I'm honored, in fact. I thank all of those that were involved in my being here. Dr. Adriel Trott, for inviting me back in January to come do this, Dr. Warren Rosenberg for inviting me some 7 to 8 years ago to do this, though health issues forced me to cancel my intended talk at that time, and to all of you students, staff, faculty, community members, if that pertains, the Sphinx Club, whoever you are and whoever I may have left unmentioned. Thank you for being here this morning. Thank you to the faculty I've met with during my time here for your participation and wisdom. And as I said, in preparation, I've been on your website quite a bit. I've read back issues of The Bachelor. I can't say that I know well what it's like to go to school or to teach or work at Wabash, but at least I know more about it today than I did a few months back. Plus, as the introduction indicated, I've been at Ohio Wesleyan, one of your sister GLCA schools, home of the Battling Bishops, since 1984, and so many of the wonderful things that I've enjoyed and cherished even about teaching at a place like Ohio Wesleyan are very clearly evident, indeed prominent, at Wabash. There are 2 things, obviously, that are very noteworthy and different in my mind. For one, and maybe really the big one, is that Ohio Wesleyan's a co-ed school, which is a huge difference. And secondly, these chapel talks. We don't have the chapel talks that you have, and I think these are wonderful. As I said, I've watched a number of them, and they have actually made me nervous because they set a pretty high bar, and I will try to man up, so to speak, and reach that bar. Now, I say this for a friend. If this was something a friend told me, you have to say this. So this is my TED Talk. All right? And he said, if nobody laughs, just say, yeah, I know, it's corny. So anyway. So let me get going with this notion of the men in our mirrors. Sometime this morning, well before you sat down here, you most likely found yourselves, at least once, standing before and had occasion to look into a mirror. And I guess I'm really talking mostly to the Wabash students here, Wabash men. But perhaps it was while shaving, or brushing your teeth. Maybe it was while combing or styling your hair, but actually, I don't know much about that anymore. Maybe you were grooming those isolated or unruly hairs that can, pop up, grow in undesired places or directions. Those I do know about a little bit. Maybe you were just washing your face. It really doesn't matter what it was that led you to be in front of the mirror. What matters for the moment and for the next 30 minutes or so with this talk is what did you see reflected back at you? And each of you, Wabash students, saw a young man. You may be white or not. You may be middle class. You may be blue collar. You may be a Hoosier. You may be from out of state. You may be a baseball player, a fraternity member, a member of the Sphinx Club. Whatever combination of these other things about you help define you, make you into you're men. What does it mean to be a young man in 21st century America? Now, a disclosure. I'm no longer a young man, and probably the bald head, the white of what's left of my hair probably gave that away. The introduction would have given that away. In fact, it's been over 40 years since I was in the same station of life as you find yourselves. So what could I know, right? What could I have to know and tell you? Well, for what it's worth, I do want to point out that alongside nearly 40 years worth of teaching young men and women, teaching and doing research on issues in masculinity and gender more generally, I do have a son, age 33, two stepsons, one 25, one 18, just a high school senior applying to college, and I also have a 31-year-old son-in-law. So I live among and care so deeply about those young men in my life as I do about my 31-year-old daughter and 21-year-old stepdaughter, just to make sure that nobody feels left out. But if you took those four young men and you lined them up, right, behind me or beside me, you could line them from left to right politically, with three of them being left of center, two of them being quite left of center, one of them being right of center, socially and politically conservative. If you sat down with them and got into a conversation, it's unlikely that they would all agree on many things, on issues of the day, so to speak. And this is true, too, of their interests. For example, you take sports. They all have some degree of interest in sports. My 33-year-old, like his dad, is all baseball, all Yankees, actually, all baseball year-round. My son-in-law is into soccer and, follows soccer and pays attention to things that happen in soccer and has played soccer. My 25-year-old stepson, who's 6'5", has been basketball. And my 18-year-old stepson is more into esports, especially Overwatch. So they have different interests. They have different politics, different values. All right? Despite these and any other differences in their interests, their tastes, their values, that make them the individuals that they are, when each of them walks away from their bathroom or bedroom mirror, walks outside or goes online, people that see them as men. And this is such a confusing time, I find, to be a man in the United States today. And for that matter, to me, it's a confusing but fascinating time, a great opportunity to teach about or be here speaking to you about men and masculinity. I would say that in my entire career, and maybe even in my lifetime, I don't recall another period where there's been so much attention, discussion, controversy, and debate directed at masculinity and being a man. When I sat where you're sitting, although it wasn't where you're sitting, it was some 12 hours, 750 miles east, right, at Brooklyn College, the City University of New York, young men like yourselves, of which I was one, worried most about living up to the mandates of masculinity. How were we going to show that we were sufficiently manly, masculine, that we could man up, so to speak, measure up, be counted upon to meet what the culture considered to be sufficiently masculine? Today, there are still some pretty clear ideas about qualities that within this culture comprise masculinity that one should at least, recognize. But there's also considerable disagreement about what qualities, what version of masculinity one should attempt to embody. Much of the most recent focus has been on negative aspects of masculinity and their consequences. those aspects that have been come to be known as toxic masculinity, which is an idea we will come back to shortly. So putting this another way, there are pressures to measure up to masculinity as we've known it, and there's also pressure to move away from masculinity as we've known it. That's tricky, right? Measure up, but move away. Recently, even in just the few months since Dr. Trott first invited me in January, there's been two pretty good examples of the kind of controversy over conflicting views on masculinity going on today. First, the Gillette ad. How many of you have seen that Gillette ad? Okay, it's 1 minute, 48 seconds. Is this the best a man can get? All right, and you know, it's drawing attention to a variety of issues. The American Psychological Association also issued guidelines for clinicians working with boys and men. Both the Gillette ad and the APA guidelines sparked a surprising volume of very divided messages, suggesting there's quite different and competing views on what men should be like. Now, to illustrate just for a moment the measure up but move away kind of dilemma, what might be seen as, you know, do we embrace and embody masculinity or reject and replace masculinity? You can consider the following, just a couple of like survey notes. According to the Pew Research Center, most men say that men in general face at least some pressure to be emotionally strong. Almost 9 out of 10 said that. To be interested in sports, over 70% said that. About 6 in 10 men say men face pressure to be willing to throw a punch if provoked, while smaller but sizable shares of men say men face pressure to join in when other men are talking about women in a sexual way, or to have many sexual partners. Looking across 4 generations, that's what Pew did. They had the data on 4 different generations, with millennials being the youngest of the 4. And I realize that those of you who are students are not millennials. Your Generation Z is, you know, I think is where we are now. But the millennials were the youngest of the 4 generations in the Pew sample, but they were also the most likely of the 4 to say that men feel pressure to throw a punch if provoked, to join in when others talk about women in a sexual way, and to have many sexual partners. I find it's telling, you know, that it's younger men who are the ones in higher numbers, higher percentages to report these kinds of pressures. Nearly 70% of millennial men said there's at least some pressure to be willing, as I said, so millennial men, that was overall, right? Among millennial men, 70% said that they felt at least some pressure to be willing to throw a punch. And almost 60% said some pressure to have many sex partners and join in when other men are talking about women in a sexual way. Another survey, just to mention it, I'm a sociologist, so you know we live and dream at night about surveys. The state of gender equality for U.S. adolescents, a study of more than 1,000 10 to 19-year-olds, found that 70% of boys 10 to 19 in this survey just done last year say they personally feel pressure to be physically strong. 44% of older boys and 35% of younger ones feel pressure to be willing to throw a punch if provoked. So we're back to that aspect. 82% of boys have heard someone tell a boy he was, quote unquote, acting like a girl, which they interpret to mean behavior that's emotional, crying, sensitive, weak, feminine, and moody or dramatic. When they feel angry, 40% of boys say society expects them to be aggressive or violent. Another third say society expects them to be strong, tough, be a man, and suck it up. So this culturally dominant version of masculinity, what's often referred to as hegemonic masculinity, carries expectations, do's and don'ts. And we impose these on ourselves and others, and we believe that others are judging us accordingly. I say, so we believe. Now, that latter point is important because research does indicate, too, that even among young men who themselves might not subscribe to this hegemonic masculinity, there is the belief that other men do. And even if we don't see ourselves within that model, we don't necessarily see that other men may feel like we feel. So we act in a certain way with our buddies, our teammates, our frat brothers, in part because we think that's what they expect or accept, even though it is possible that we're wrong, right? That they're feeling the same kind of questioning. According to psychologist Alan Berkowitz, this is a quote, "Most men don't want to be the kind of man that they've been taught to be, but don't know that others feel similarly." He notes that research reveals that college men, like yourselves, overestimate how often or how much other men have sex, use drugs or alcohol, tolerate or accept homophobia, desire to hook up, have a desire to gamble, are willing to use force to have sex, or believe in rape myths. And they underestimate other men's discomfort with language or behavior degrading to women, willingness to intervene to prevent sexual assault, desire to make sure that their sexual interactions are consensual, and their desire to act against injustice. So there's potential misunderstanding, even as we go through our lives, looking at those men back at ourselves in a mirror. What does this so-called hegemonic masculinity look like or consist of? These themes, these masculinity themes, the stifling of feminine qualities, the suppressing of emotional displays other than anger, a need to outperform or outdo others, earn more, score more, win more, hiding of or even denying fear and vulnerability, avoidance of any sign of weakness, and an ability, even a need, to show aggression when deemed appropriate or necessary. We don't want to show signs of weakness, and especially tears or fears. Don't want to be the lowest scorer in the class, the slowest runner in a race, the last to finish an exam. Don't want to appear to need or seek help. Don't and won't back down from a challenge, and can't let any insult or provocation go unanswered. Now, I'm not saying that any of that describes any one of you as an individual, but these are the kinds of qualities that are under that heading, that hegemonic masculinity. And behaving contrary to that dominant model, acting less than masculine, subjects us to the judgments of peers and others, those who patrol, so to speak, the boundaries of acceptable masculinity and femininity. Sociologist C.J. Pascoe's book, Dude, You're a Fag, which was a study of a California high school, Pascoe found that among the young people that she studied, this label, fag, was not so much directed at males known to be gay, but rather at males who seemed insufficiently masculine. Insufficiently masculine. What does that even look like, really? Well, I can tell you what it's looked like or felt like in my own life. All my life, I've struggled with what I came to call, I don't know if my dad gave me this label, loose tear ducts. My way of describing my lifelong tendency to cry easily. You have tissues? Just in case. I don't expect to cry, but I never know. It just happens, right? Most of the time it's happened, I get choked up, or I worry about starting to tear up. I feel it burning in the back of my throat, or the tears start to fog up my glasses. And most of the time I could point to, I say, there's appropriate moments, right? Acceptable displays, like tearing up when I witnessed the birth of both my kids. Tearing up when I first proposed to and later exchanged wedding vows with my wife. Or when I gave a long, very heartfelt toast at my daughter's wedding and broke down. Or a eulogy at my first wife's funeral. Or even when I spoke from the heart at a retirement reception for a longtime colleague and friend, right? And without, trying to or preventing, right? It happened. Sometimes it happens at more mundane moments, such as when my wife and I, two formerly married and widowed people, sat and watched Brother Bear together. Yeah, Brother Bear, right? Many years ago, and both cried. Or on the many occasions when we've watched episodes of This Is Us, and both cried. Thinking back across my life, and the point more here is I remember other times and how hard it was if I felt like I was about to cry in front of other guys, especially when I was very young. There was a time when the public school down the street from where I lived in Brooklyn started locking the fence to the schoolyard on the weekends. Those of us who had been accustomed to playing in the schoolyard would have to climb the fence if we wanted to still play there. Well, that first day, I couldn't climb the fence. Strike one. Most, maybe even all of the other boys, the younger guys, all climbed the fence. Strike two. And then, compounding the inability to climb, I teared up. Strike three, right? I was out. Yikes. Fast forward a few years later, the neighborhood theater, at a time when the theater showed only one movie. And I don't know if that's true of the theater downtown or if you have multiplex or whatever. But anyway, the neighborhood theater showed only one movie, and they were showing Love Story, a true tearjerker. And my friends and I went because there was no other movie. And, we were bored, and it had been weeks. So we went to Love Story. And at the end, there's a spoiler alert, the female lead succumbs to cancer. I came perilously close. I fought hard against it, did my best to mask it, but came perilously close to tearing up, right? Felt that, thing in the back of my throat. But that's not what mattered to my 14-year-old self, right? I should say, before I skipped a line there, right? It's very likely that some of my friends I was with may have been feeling the same thing. But I didn't know that. And that's not what mattered. I wasn't checking for their tears. I was trying to check my own. After all, I had to be a man, or I had to be, it wasn't masculine. Now, gradually, I have come to accept this quality about myself. I can't really control it. I see it in other people. I have a dear colleague who's now retired, and I used to say, you can always tell when he cares about something because it's in his eyes. They well up, they water up. My son, when he was young and sat and was watching Charlotte's Web. Have you seen Charlotte's Web? Anyway, here's another spoiler alert. Charlotte dies, right? The spider dies. And I noticed as we were watching this, I saw him with tears in his eyes, and I said, that's okay. And he said, no, I just yawned. I used that same line countless times. No, I just yawned, right? Because sometimes when you yawn, it brings tears to your eyes. Anyway, right, now I've come to accept this about myself. It's who I am. It's how I'm made. And I say, as I told my son, listen, tears mean you feel, and feelings make you human, right? So don't be ashamed. And it isn't just tears that either we try to avoid or I've kind of struggled with in terms of this whole notion of masculinity. It's any sign of weakness. And another story, I remember when my first wife and I were living in Somerville, Massachusetts, a mostly working class city on a mostly working class street north of Boston. Perhaps as a reflection of our effort to be fully equal partners, perhaps influenced by disturbing news stories we'd read about seemingly healthy young men dropping dead. And who knows, partly maybe due to the fact that I wasn't in the greatest physical shape, we had a system for shoveling snow. Okay? Whenever substantial snow had fallen, buried our car, we would go out, take turns digging out our car. I'd shovel for 5 or 10 minutes, she'd shovel for 5 or 10 minutes. She'd hand me the shovel, I'd shovel for 5 or 10 minutes, I'd hand it back to her, she'd shovel for 5 or 10 minutes. And it worked, okay? So whenever substantial snow buried our car, we did this. We took these turns, all fair and equal. Well, there's this one occasion that stands out, and I always remember, and I've actually told classes of students about, where after we'd had a lot of snow, we took our shovel, we were out there. You might think, why didn't they just buy a second shovel, right? But it's beside the point. Right? If there was a second shovel in this story, the story doesn't work. But this is true, okay? So anyway, so I had shoveled, and she had shoveled, and I shoveled again, and I handed her the shovel, and she started to shovel. And then I noticed from behind her, right, this middle-aged couple, these neighbors that lived directly across the street from us, were coming around the corner from a walk, right? Suddenly, I felt compelled to take charge and shovel some more. I said to my wife, let me shovel. I feel good, I feel strong, I'll shovel some more. And she looked at me and she said, why? You shoveled, I shoveled. You just shoveled again, so now it's my turn. I said, no, really, just let me shovel some more. I don't mind, in fact, it probably will do me good. I don't remember exactly what she said to that, but trust me, she was confused. She hesitated a bit about handing me the shovel. And then she noticed our neighbors enter her line of vision. At which point she drew the shovel closer to herself and started digging very, very vigorously, maybe even grunting to make the point. But the point was, right, I'm imagining, what are these neighbors thinking? What must they be thinking? I suppose I imagine them asking themselves, like your website asks, what kind of man, right? What kind of man stands there idly by watching his wife dig out their car? And they didn't know that I'd shoveled, right? So that, to me, this was about impression management, to use, sociological language. It's likely that at some point later, my wife said something to me to the effect of, "You of all people should know better," which is something she also said to me on other occasions, as does my current wife, who, when standing either in front of a sink full of dishes or a house that needs vacuuming, reminds me, you teach gender. You teach masculinity. You should know better than this. In truth, I should have known better, right? After all, I was underway with doctoral research interviewing men on masculinity. I'd been teaching gender in sociology classes. Yeah, I should have known better. But there's a major reason I wanted that shovel at that moment, and it's really the same reason I tried to stifle the too easy flow of tears. It's about masculinity, or at least it was for me. Measuring up. I have felt some of that pressure. Be a man. Man up. Don't be a sissy or a wuss or some other such epithet. Now, we should note that there really is no one way or no one right way to be as a man, no one type of man to be. Gender studies, we talk about there being multiple masculinities and multiple femininities, and that variations exist among those based on such things as social class, race, age, sexuality, possibly religion or religiosity, region, nation, culture, lots of different ways, okay? This is the wisdom in what's called intersectionality. The recognition that, yes, we're all gendered, or we all have learned gender, but we're more than just our genders. Now, if you turn and look to your left or to your right, or behind you or in front of you at other Wabash men here, you know that even if you all adhere to the Wabash gentleman's rule, and you have that in common, you're not all the same, right? There are different ways to express masculinity. We have choices in terms of how we choose to enact or perform our masculinity, and that notion of performing our masculinity, that's actually additional wisdom in sociology and gender studies. You know, gender is something that we do, something that we produce, not just something that we are, maybe more than what we are, it's what we do. So there's no one way to be a man. We can choose among different ways of being a man, but we also do still face judgments from others, or think that we will, for the performances we do of our masculinity, what we do or don't display. Okay? And the masculinity we choose to enact has consequences, both for ourselves and for those around us. Now, there's been a lot of discussion in popular, let me check my time here, a lot of discussion in popular and academic circles, even among medical and psychological professionals, about how certain aspects of traditional or hegemonic masculinity can be problematic, harmful, toxic, both to men who attempt to live up to them, as well as to those who don't or can't, and of course to women and children. That's where that Gillette ad fits in. That's where the American Psychological Association was coming from. Two examples among many efforts to identify problematic consequences that can follow from rigid notions of masculinity. What kinds of consequences? A host of personal, academic, social problems, including disproportionate rates of academic challenge, academic suspensions, think high school and younger, academic suspensions, expulsions, higher rates of dropping out of high school, fighting, mental health issues, including suicides, later physical health problems, violence, sexual violence, alcohol, substance abuse, relationship and family problems can be partially tied. They're not the only thing, they're partially tied to trying to embody these masculine norms, especially those that stress dominance, emotional inexpressiveness, self-reliance, and violence. And those have also been found to be associated with depression, decreased help-seeking, increased risk-taking, and the suppression of vulnerable emotions such as sadness, anxiety, or fear. You can see it linked to alcohol use as well. Drinking may be associated with masculinity in different ways. Drinking just because men are supposed to drink. Drinking to excess because drinking more makes you more masculine. Or drinking to excess because one doesn't feel masculine. So college men, it turns out, drink more than non-college men, and fraternity men tend to drink more than other college men. And that's not a knock on fraternities or certainly on college men. It's just what some of the data tell us. And there are other problems: disengagement, poor help seeking, overrepresentation in college judicial proceedings, right? Harassment, bias-related incidents. So these are things that even, they're not directly linked to masculinity, but they're part of what masculinity can do. There's a great book by a writer named Mark Gerson back from the 1980s, A Choice of Heroes, and he says, only a fool, only an ideologue would claim that the sole cause of war is masculinity, but only a fool would deny there's a connection. And that's how I'd look at all those problem areas. No one is saying that if you enact masculinity, if you perform masculinity, you're destined to those issues. But there's a connection between the kind of masculinity we try and display and some of those problems. And I've said little about it, but how we choose to be as men is also potentially hurtful to others around us, friends, families, those we love, our children, the people we work or go to school with, the women we date have been, the women we know who maybe have been sexualized and objectified or mistreated. Those are what was meant by toxic masculinity. And I do want to just give you a little bit on that. This is a definition of toxic masculinity from the Good Men Project. And I like it. I like what it tells us because it gets us past some of the controversy about it. And if you don't think there's been controversy, do this when you get a chance. Just Google the term toxic masculinity and read the things that follow, okay? Anyway, this is how they talk about it. They say, toxic masculinity describes norms of accepted behavior among men that are portrayed as good and natural, but are in reality physically, socially, and psychologically damaging. But here's what's important. The toxicity doesn't come from being male or masculine. It doesn't describe all or even most masculine-coded behaviors or ideals. Excelling at sports, for example, isn't considered to be part of toxic masculinity, neither is being ambitious or having the drive to succeed. The desire to improve yourself and achieve more is rightfully lauded as a good thing. And they go on, masculinity becomes toxic when specific standards of behavior are encouraged and enforced despite being damaging. Dominance, violence, unchecked sexual aggression, self-reliance to the point of absurdity, and the devaluation of anything seen as being feminine are all points where masculinity goes from being positive to toxic. It's the mandating of the limited scope of what men are allowed to be if they're to be considered men. So, to talk, teach, or write about toxic masculinity or masculinity's less healthy aspects in the way that I've been doing is not to demonize boys or men. It doesn't condemn many of the particular qualities society, and all of the particular qualities society has deemed masculine: self-reliance, for example, courage, for example, service, for example, may be part of what increasingly psychologists and sociologists are referring to as positive masculinity. But we do need to think more broadly and promote a model of masculinity that leaves lots of room for different ways that we can be. And again, not every aspect of what we think of as masculinity is problematic, okay? Take competitiveness, if you want. You know, we talk about how men compete. Just this past Saturday, I participated in my highly competitive fantasy baseball auction. And though these people are my friends and colleagues, I just so badly want to beat them. Badly. 2 years ago, I finished first. Last year, I finished 8th. Anyway, or when I'm at Planet Fitness, where I go 3 to 4 times a week. I like the no judgment aspect of Planet Fitness. But when someone gets on the bike or the elliptical next to me, privately to myself, I say, okay, friend, I am going to outlast you or outdistance you. Right? It's competitiveness, but it's a different kind of competitiveness. And I grant you, if I stay too long, I might be taking health risks, but not everything done competitively is problematic. It's when everything becomes competitive that it becomes problematic. The same can be said about stoicism and inexpressiveness. They may have their, occasions when they're important, especially as you're, experiencing perhaps certain kinds of crisis. But sort of like in the ability, in the words of Hoosier John Mellencamp, to suck it up, tough it out, and be the best you can. Right? In many circumstances, that may be helpful. But when you're hurting and you keep it inside, right, it may become toxic. Okay, anyway, this whole performative aspect, I'm going to run through this because I know I'm long here. Masculinity, this takes us back to choices. You do have choices. And even if you decide that the hegemonic masculinity in its ways, its aspects, is fine for you, that's perfect, that's what you want to be, right? Leave room, recognize the consequences that can happen, and don't automatically expect that from the other men. You know, take another look to your right or your left, in front of you or behind you. The men you see ought not be automatically judged or judge you by how closely you either fit or don't fit a single version of masculinity. You know, when I've taught gender classes, right, you look at the data. Sociologists love data. I've said that before. You look at the data on politics, on economics, on the division of domestic labor, housework, and childcare, and you know it all shows what looks like male advantage, right? That in wages, in opportunities, right? And although things are equalizing some, right, men have had privilege. And so, you know, you look at that, and then you look at some other things, right? The mixed message. You look at the other things. Men don't live as long. Men's friendships aren't as intimate. Men are less involved with the children that we have and raise. We have almost a virtual monopoly on the destructive criminal behavior that lands people in prison or jail. Okay, higher rates of accidental deaths related to risk-taking, aggressive driving, excessive speed. These kinds of prices are real. So then you look at the two sides and you say, okay, right? If you only focus on, right, the privilege list, how do you make change? Why would you make change? And about the best I can do with that is that you operate on a sense of justice or fairness, right? Out of fairness and justice, equality, right? Help everyone live better lives. Once you add the second set of issues, the kind of price list of masculinity, you could make a valid claim that men would benefit, live longer, healthier, happier, more fulfilling lives, trying less hard to manifest this version of masculinity. Now, I grant you that's an oversimplification of the kind that teachers and speakers sometimes engage in, just to make students or audiences think about a topic or an issue. And I want you to think about this issue, okay? Think about it, ask yourselves, maybe in conversations in your residence halls or your fraternity houses, wherever you might congregate, maybe in gender studies classes, or maybe when you're standing in front of the mirror, right? Ask yourself if there's a price that you think you might be paying for trying to live up to and embody a masculinity that restricts you from expressing your emotions, dissuades you from seeking or accepting help when you're struggling, turns many activities, including those that shouldn't be, classes, drinking behavior, into competitions, and leaves you quietly complicit, if not actively a participant in sexist or homophobic talk, right? Ask yourselves. Encourage your brothers, your friends, your classmates to do likewise. Call out, sexist, homophobic behavior. Be willing to, move beyond the mask of masculinity. And I am closing now. I want to just go back to the point about the opening, about the men in our mirrors. So 2 quick things. As a sociologist, I feel it important to say that what we don't see in the mirror, or what we can't see in a mirror, is really important. The wider society, the institutions and structures that shape your opportunities or impose obstacles on you. That society, those social structures, still unequally reward people based on gender. So we need to recognize that it's not as simple, right? It won't all happen just by saying, I think I'll be a different kind of man, okay? The second and final point is with regard to the title, The Men in Our Mirrors. Ever since I opted for that title, I've repeatedly found myself drawn to the lyrics of a song from the 1980s written by Saida Garrett and Glenn Ballard. I won't try to sing it to you. If I was in the shower, I might. On my drive back to Ohio, I might. But here I won't. Anyway, the lyric goes like this. This is the chorus. I'm starting with the man in the mirror. I'm asking him to change his ways. And no message could have been any clearer. If you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and make a change. So I'd ask you to ask yourselves, right, whether and how your life may be affected by trying to embody aspects of traditional masculinity that have been linked to the kinds of problems I mentioned. Ask yourself whether and how trying to embody those qualities negatively affects other people and your relationships with them. And if you want to enjoy the healthy masculinity traits and avoid these, make some changes. Thanks.